The first weekend of the playoffs is in the books, which means another round of coach candidates are available for the Chicago Bears to interview. And the Minnesota Vikings collapse to the Los Angeles Rams really highlighted some of the major red flaws for one of the top candidates, defensive coordinator Brian Flores.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On the show today, we look at the candidacy of Brian Flores as sort of an example here of how to evaluate and weigh some of the red flags and question marks surrounding each of these Bears coaching candidates. We'll look at Flores specifically, but then sort of compare Flores' candidacy to some of the other head coaching candidates that also have question marks or red flags surrounding them, and how it ends up kind of being a pick your flavor kind of thing. Well, what risk are you most willing to accept with a variety of these candidates, all of whom have flaws in some way, shape, or form, and which flaws are you most comfortable with? Well, it's a little tough sometimes, especially after you watch the Vikings defense collapse like that, to be super thrilled with Brian Flores' flaws specifically here, because they gave up a lot of points and made it too easy, really, for the Los Angeles Rams. 27-9, the final score there, but I mean, they had 24 in the first half and then kind of took the foot off the gas there. It was no answers from the Vikings defense. And everyone's been talking about Sam Darnold and the quarterback play being what derailed the Vikings, and that's certainly a big part of this, but it's helped Brian Flores skirt by a little bit here, because not only did they give up 27 to the Rams, and again, 24 in just the first half alone, but in the last regular season game against the Lions, they give up 31. And again, in both games, Sam Darnold doesn't play well, so that's what everyone's kind of talking about. But with Flores, this is not just a one-time, okay, at the end of this season, the defense kind of dropped off a little bit trend here. They won 8 games in a row during the season, and the defense played pretty well throughout the year. They finished top 5 in scoring and top 15 in yards, I believe, and top 5 in rushing defense. There's a lot to like about the Minnesota Vikings defense. And I'm not here to say that Brian Flores is actually a bad defensive coach, but we've seen now this concerning trend over Brian Flores' career of his defense is playing well, and then at the end of the season, when the games matter the most, they disappear. They collapse. They're not up to the level that they need to be in ways that cost their team significantly. And if it just happens once with the Vikings, okay, maybe we can look past it. But when it happened 3 years in a row, when he was head coach of the Miami Dolphins, now continuing to the Minnesota Vikings, that's when it becomes more of a concern. So you go back to, you start with this year, 2024, of course, get crushed by the Lions and the Rams in Week 18 in the playoffs. You go back to his last year in Miami, 2022. The final 7 games of that season, including the playoffs, they lose 6 of their final 7 games. They lose 5 in a row, they win 1 more, and then they lose in the playoffs. Over that stretch, giving up more than 25 points per game. They completely dropped off. And again, Tua Tagovailoa injuries and stuff play a factor in that, but the defense drops off over that stretch too. Or you go back the year before that, 2021. They're 9 and I think they're 8-8 or whatever it is late in that season. They got to play the Tennessee Titans in Week 17. They win this game, then they have a chance to make the playoffs. They lose, and they give up 34 points to Ryan Tannehill and Mike Vrabel's Tennessee Titans. Late in the season, they needed their defense to play well for one super critical game with the playoffs on the line, and they couldn't do it. And they blew it. At the time, they were 8-7 coming into that game. The second to last game of the season, they were 8-7. They needed to win out to make the playoffs. They lost the Titans. They ended up beating the Patriots and finished 9-8. But they could have gone 10-7 there and potentially made the postseason. But they gave up 34 points to Ryan Tannehill and the Tennessee Titans, losing that game. Then you've got 2020, his second year with Miami Dolphins. Week 18, win and you're in. They're 10-5 heading into the last game of the season against the rival Buffalo Bills. 10-5 heading into the last game. Win and you're in. They give up 56 points to Josh Allen and the Bills. Not just like a close 35-point game, 56 points in the most critical game of the season. The defense collapses. And certainly in his first year in Miami, they were the 32nd ranked defense in football. Like each and every year, there have been mostly just late season issues with Brian Flores dating back to his time in Miami. And that's a real concern. If, okay, the aggressive blitzing style thing works all regular season and you could go on some win streaks, that's great. But when you need a game and you need your defense to be at its absolute best and they can't deliver, what was all of that worth then when you lose in the wild card round to the Los Angeles Rams, when you lose in week 18 to the Lions, or when you lose at the end of the season and miss the playoffs 3 straight times with the Miami Dolphins? Like that's a real concern here from Brian Flores. And that's like specifically to his specialty, the defensive side of the ball. Because that doesn't include all of the concerns, question marks, red flags as far as leadership and managing the quarterback position with everything that we've heard from Tua Tagovailoa and now Ryan Fitzpatrick have both come out and had less than positive things to say, and in some ways very negative things to say about Brian Flores. Ryan Fitzpatrick, I should give him credit. He's tried to kind of walk it back and say, listen, like, I'm still friends with Brian Flores. I still think he's a great coach. It's just, pointing out some things he saw and claims some of the stuff he said was taken a little bit out of context. And I want to go through a little bit of that stuff specifically because I want to use that as a jumping off point to try and compare. Like, okay, Brian Flores has some flaws. He also has defenses that are consistently aggressive and strong. I mean, they were a top 6 defense in 2020 with the Dolphins. They were 16th in 2021, and they were 24th in 2022. But they were still getting after teams and still being an aggressive blitzing team. And obviously with the Vikings, he's been a great defensive coordinator for them and someone that they've been happy to have there. He just hasn't been able to get over the Ben Johnson matchup there. So there's a lot to like from him as a defensive coach, just like how every coach on the Bears head coaching search, or not every coach, most of the coaches on the Bears list of candidates, you can find stuff to like about him. Like, oh yeah, I can see why they would want to interview Brian Flores. I can see why they'd want to interview Todd Monken or Joe Brady or Pete Carroll or whoever it is, on the list. Like there's positive aspects of it, but each of them has some flaws too. So I want to look specifically at some of this stuff with Brian Flores and then how that compares to the question marks for some of these other head coaching candidates next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's an extra $300 on top of your winnings to keep the action going. Whether you're betting on these playoff teams or you can bet on the NBA, college sports, hockey season is right in the mix now, the tennis, boxing, all the combat sports, you name it, they've got it all on FanDuel. And the FanDuel app is easy to navigate. When you win, you get paid instantly, no waiting around for your winnings. So whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs, FanDuel has you covered. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. There is no true, perfect head coach candidate for the Bears to hire. There's guys you might like more than others, but everyone's got some different question marks here. And it's a game of whose question marks and red flags are you most comfortable with? Can you tolerate or feel like is the least risky for your team to get the best head coach out of the mix? We talked about some of the stuff with Brian Flores' defense. There's also plenty of stuff for his leadership and coaching aspects of things. Yes, he's viewed as a disciplined guy that perhaps the Bears could use a bit more discipline, but there's a way to do that well, and there's a way to do that less well. And that's how you get someone like Tua Tagovailoa, who by all accounts is a very seemingly nice, kind, soft-spoken kind of young man who's got some good leadership skills or whatever, who says on the Dan Le Batard show that he referred to Brian Flores as a terrible person. He said, when you've got this terrible person telling you X, Y, and Z, like I think one of the quotes from Tua where he was kind of comparing Brian Flores to Mike McDaniel, who's there now, he said, to put it in simplest terms, if you woke up every morning and I told you that you sucked at what you did, that you don't belong doing what you do, that you shouldn't be here, that this guy should be here, and that you haven't earned this. And then you have somebody else who comes in and tells you, dude, you're the best fit for this. You're accurate, you're the best. How would it make you feel listening to one or the other? So he's obviously referring there to Brian Flores being the person who says, you suck at what you do. You don't belong playing quarterback in the NFL. You shouldn't be here. This other quarterback should be playing, and you haven't earned this, Tua. That doesn't feel like the best way to coach up a quarterback and get the most out of him. Certainly it wasn't for Tua Tagovailoa. I mean, maybe there are individuals who that style of coaching is more effective for, but I've talked to enough psychologists and professors in college and in other jobs as a producer. Like, there's pretty clear studies that type of negative reinforcement does not work nearly as well as positive reinforcement universally across the board. Like, yeah, it's the old school tough guy way of doing it. It doesn't work as well, and it's outdated, and that's not how the NFL operates. That's not how other locker rooms are operating. At least not that level of you suck, you're bad at your job, you don't deserve to be here. You could say, okay, well, that's just one quarterback who we didn't get along with, and everyone's going to have certain individual people they don't necessarily get along with. But then you add in Ryan Fitzpatrick, who's played for a lot of coaches and seen a lot of different things. And Ryan Fitzpatrick says Brian Flores' experience as a Dolphins head coach turned him into a dictator. That over his few years in Miami, he saw Flores change and his ego got a little bit bigger and he was all about me, I'm in charge, we do what I say, my way or the highway kind of thing. And he wasn't able to properly handle the leadership aspects of running a team effectively in that regard. And those are major, major, major red flags because now we have questions about, okay, the defense collapses all the time. And also we have questions about, is he going to run a locker room very well? And that to me like moves Brian Flores down the head coach rankings quite a bit. I mean, he was a guy who I think I would have put towards the bottom of a top 5 early on in this process, but like watching the defense collapse the last 2 weeks and then added in everything we knew about the quarterback situations, like that's a lot for him to have to answer for compared to a bunch of other candidates that have a lot less for them to answer for. He deserves a chance to answer for them and, prove to you that things would be different or better or whatever it might be. But nonetheless, that's tough. But you have to compare that against everybody else's red flags. And I think each one's kind of got their own flavor here. Like, yeah, like some guys have less. Like I think Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn are kind of in this clean category from the Lions where it's like, yeah, we don't know how good of a head coach they'll be, but we don't really have any questions about how good Ben Johnson coaches offense. We don't have a ton of questions about how well Aaron Glenn coaches the Lions defense. Like those guys are about as comfortable of a candidate in terms of what they do on their side of the ball as you can get from a coordinator who's never been a head coach before, who you just don't know if there's going to be a good head coach or not until they actually do it. But at least you feel like they're both really solid coordinators that don't have a lot of those other question marks. Everybody else has a little bit more. And I think talk about Brian Flores having these sort of defensive collapses and the quarterback relationships. And I think we just talked on yesterday's podcast about Mike McCarthy and how, like, yes, he's won a lot of football games, whatever, but he's always been an underachiever. Like, that's one of the big concerns for him. They don't have much postseason success. He only won one Super Bowl with Aaron Rodgers. The ceiling feels lower with Mike McCarthy. That's a real concern. Are you hiring somebody who can take you to Super Bowls, or are you just hiring somebody who can get you in the playoffs and lose in the first round? Like, that's a very real concern, but you weigh that against Brian Flores' collapses in quarterbacks, right? It's like, okay, how did that work? Or Pete Carroll is old. That's kind of seems like the main one. And he had some postseason failures, sure, certainly. But Pete Carroll's old. How long are you going to have Pete Carroll as your head coach? Like, that's his area of concern. And then I think you've got a couple of different coordinator candidates, not named Aaron Glenn and Ben Johnson, who are intriguing, but also have questions. Like Joe Brady, the Bills offensive coordinator, or Todd Monken, the Ravens offensive coordinator. We've touched on them a little bit on the podcast, but it's like Joe Brady has been great this season with Josh Allen, but he never really got head coaching looks until he was working with Josh Allen. He was the coordinator for the Panthers for a couple seasons, coordinated in college a little bit, seems to be somebody who has a good reputation, but all of a sudden now he's a great offensive coordinator because he's working with Josh Allen. Is he a great offensive coordinator, or is he a good offensive coordinator with a great quarterback? That's a real question. I'm not saying he's not a great offensive coordinator. It's just harder to tell when we haven't seen him be nearly as successful until he got to work with one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. And couldn't a lot of offensive coordinators be pretty successful with one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL? I know, like with Brady, we can point to a bunch of other stuff in terms of the weapons in Buffalo and et cetera. Yeah, each guy you can craft an argument for. But like Todd Monken, similar conversation in Baltimore. He'd been an offensive coordinator with a couple of different teams in the NFL. He'd been a college offensive coordinator. He'd been a college head coach. Never really was in the head coaching interview cycle quite like this until he comes to the Baltimore Ravens and is really good with Lamar Jackson, one of the best quarterbacks in football. And again, like, did Todd Monken all of a sudden become that much better of an offensive coordinator? Or did he just start working with a much, much better quarterback? And okay, if you take Joe Brady away from Josh Allen, or you take Todd Monken away from Lamar Jackson, are they going to still be as good of an offensive coordinator if their quarterback is not top 3 in football? Like, however good you think Caleb Williams might be able to be, you still want to give him the best possible offensive coordinator. And are these guys as good of offensive coordinators as the likes of Ben Johnson and company, or are they just working with better quarterbacks? That's kind of the question mark there. They may be great offensive coordinators who would be great with Caleb Williams and be a perfect hire for the Bears. That very well could be the case. We just don't know for sure because we're really only seeing them be this great when the quarterbacks they're with are great. And we can throw Cliff Kingsbury in this conversation too, where it's like, he's had a bunch of collapses when he was the Arizona Cardinals head coach and the Texas Tech head coach with Kyler Murray and Patrick Mahomes. Certainly doing really well with Jaden Daniels right now, but is he all of a sudden a better head coach 2 years removed from the last time he was a head coach when Cardinals fans were pretty fed up with him? Like, that's one of the hard parts about all these guys who've been head coaches before. It's like Dolphins fans really didn't like Flores anymore. Cowboys fans and Packers fans really didn't like McCarthy anymore. Cardinals fans didn't like Kingsbury anymore. Seahawks fans probably felt the best about Pete Carroll, but they were kind of ready to move on there too. It's hard to get really excited about a guy that you've just watched other fan bases be not very excited about and maybe be happy to see those guys move on. Like, that's what's more intriguing about a first-time head coach like Joe Brady, like Todd Monken, like Aaron Glenn, like Ben Johnson, because it's what you do know versus what you don't know. And that's, I think, part of the tough argument for Flores, for McCarthy, and for Kingsbury especially, that I want to dive into a little bit more here, is this idea of, like, when you try and compare risks and try and compare concerns and questions, some things, sometimes having more information about these coaches from their previous stops is a disadvantage, even though you'd think, well, they've been able to prove what they can do a little bit more. Shouldn't that be an advantage? Well, sometimes it's sort of devil you know versus devil you don't. And we'll look at that for these coordinators versus these previously experienced head coaches next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. Growing your small business in 2025 comes down to how well you can hire. And let's face it, better hires start with smarter insights. That's where LinkedIn comes in. With the strongest hiring data available, LinkedIn helps you identify the right candidates, giving you the confidence to make the best decisions for your business. I love LinkedIn. I'm a member of LinkedIn. Post updates on LinkedIn. A lot of my friends, family members, and coworkers are on LinkedIn. That's what makes it a game changer to finding the right candidates, because everyone's on there, even if they're not necessarily actively looking for jobs. LinkedIn helps you get connected to the best candidates using data you won't find anywhere else. With unique skills and interests to the connections that you share, LinkedIn helps you find the right person for the job. 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn has helped them find high-quality candidates. So hire smarter this year and find your next great hire on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. The Bears are going to be weighing each coaching candidate's red flags next to each other. And you end up getting sort of two categories here of coordinators who would become first-time head coaches if the Bears hired them, and guys who have been head coaches before, and the Bears would be giving them another chance to prove that this time is different. And I will say, from an interviewing standpoint, I think it's more advantageous if I'm a coaching candidate who's been a head coach before, who can come in and say, I've done this before, I know exactly what I did wrong. I made these mistakes, and here's how I'm going to do it differently for you in Chicago. That's an easier sell, I think, from a candidate standpoint to the team, as opposed to a coordinator like Brady or Monken or Glenn or Johnson coming in and saying, well, no, I've never been a head coach before, but hypothetically, this is how I would handle that situation, or this is who I'll rely on if I get into this situation. And it becomes a question, it becomes a matter of like, you don't know what you don't know as a candidate. If you've never been a head coach before, you just might not know all of the potential little things that could come up along the way that you never realized because you've never done it before. I mean, you've seen it from afar, but you haven't been sitting alone in the office making those head coaching decisions, right? Like you just haven't been able to actually do the job. Like that's a huge, huge, huge part of the risk for Ben Johnson, Aaron Glenn, Joe Brady, Todd Monken. Like that's one of them. That's kind of the whole thing there is like, well, you just don't know. There's no perfect way to predict or assess how well they're going to do a thing that they've never actually done before. But all the former head coaches come with a pre-existing list of things they've done wrong and things that shake your confidence in their ability to do things right in the future. And so it really becomes a question of like, do you swing for the unknown guy and hope that your evaluations are as strong as possible to determine that someone like Ben Johnson can be a great head coach, even though he's never had to do it before? Or are you more easily sold on the idea of like, boy, Brian Flores really sounds like someone who's learned. And, if Brian Flores goes into that interview and says, yeah, I treated Tua the wrong way. I handled that quarterback situation wrong. I let my ego get out of control. I noticed right away all these things I did wrong. And I have learned and grown in these ways. And I have these mentors helping keep me in check for that kind of stuff. And I would hire these coaches to keep tabs on that kind of stuff. And I would communicate all these things to you. And like, here's why, if you just give me a second chance, my defense is going to be good. Here's who I'm going to bring as my offensive coordinator. We're going to get Caleb Williams right. Like, we're going to do all this stuff. We're going to bring discipline back. These guys are going to play harder. They're going to have fewer penalties. They're going to do all this stuff. If you could just give me that chance, because I've seen all the error in my ways. Like you can hear yourself being sold on something like that. Or, same thing can be true for Cliff Kingsbury, or I think for Mike McCarthy on his third head coaching stop, or Pete Carroll at age 72. It's probably a little bit of a harder of a sell, because it's like, okay, like you've been doing this for decades now. Why is now going to be different than it was last time? Whereas at least like Kingsbury or Brian Flores is like, hey, I only had one shot at this and I was a little young, a little green, but if you give me that second chance, now I know I'm going to do better. Because it's you can start to talk yourself into it, saying like, we've seen coaches who their first head coaching job was just not the right job for them, and it didn't work out the way they wanted to. But when they get that second chance, they do show that they learned a lot, and they do elevate their team to that next level. I mean, there's sort of two most obvious ones here. Like Andy Reid was certainly successful in Philadelphia, but a lot more successful in Kansas City. And then the big one is Bill Belichick, right? From the Cleveland Browns. And then, I mean, like, wasn't he like New York Jets head coach for like a day technically? But you know what I mean? Like actual tenures there, going from Browns head coach in the 90s to the Patriots in the early 2000s, like so much better the second time around. Like goes from failed head coach in Cleveland to maybe the greatest head coach of all time in New England. And that second chance was him selling the team, saying, hey, I've learned, I've improved, I'm going to do things differently, and I'm going to do better with my second chance here with this team. The problem is, I guess a couple things here. One, when I think about Bill Belichick specifically, there was a lot of time in between those head coaching stops. He left the Browns in 95, became the Patriots head coach in 2000. He spent some time as a defensive coordinator for a few years in between there, and had some time to reflect and learn and grow. That hasn't been that much time for Kingsbury or Brian Flores. I guess Flores has been 2 years now. Kingsbury's been about 2 years now. But Pete Carroll, it's been 1 year. Mike McCarthy hasn't really had a year off, really. Or I guess he did. He had 1 year off between Packers and Dallas, I suppose. But there hasn't been much time for them to reflect and to get other perspectives and to see different areas of the ways. Now, at the other end of that, Andy Reid jumped from 1 year to the next, 2012 to 2013. Eagles to Chiefs, and was better right away. But I think that's a little bit different. of a situation comparatively. And it's also easy to like sell yourself on like, oh yeah, this is going to be the coach who's really a lot better his second time around. And we forget that like a lot of other coaches have had second chances and aren't any better. Like we don't remember the failures as much as we do the big successes. Cause it's like, oh, Belichick and Reed, like second chances are what's great for those guys. But like, think about Mike McCarthy in Dallas. There's a great example. Like he got a second chance in Dallas and, was 12-5 for a few years, but didn't have like more success in Dallas. He wasn't some new, better head coach. He was just the same guy in a different spot. Or you think about Doug Peterson getting a second chance in Jacksonville. It didn't necessarily go that well. Dennis Allen gets a second chance with the New Orleans Saints. And with any of these coaches, you can point to, well, the roster was bad here, there were injuries there. Like the individual examples are not important. The point is that like for every coach who has a great second landing spot, there's a handful of coaches who get a second chance and don't end up doing much with it and end up just kind of flaming out. You can look back at John Fox as well, when he came to the Chicago Bears, like third team, and Mike McCarthy, third team, Pete Carroll, third team. Like it just doesn't, it's no guaranteed sign of a coach getting better. And sometimes they're even worse in that later spot than they were in their previous spot, thanks to John Fox, for example, there. So I find myself feeling like if I'm the Chicago Bears, I would rather take the risk on a first-time head coach and shoot for the stars, aim for the Super Bowl, aim high, get me the best possible coach. Mike McCarthy might be a safer coaching hire. I don't know about Brian Flores at this point. Brian Flores could be a safer coaching hire. He's been a head coach before. Cliff Kingsbury could be a safer coaching hire. They'll win you 7, 8, 9 games each season. But are they going to win you Super Bowls? Or are they always going to leave you thinking like, man, keep getting stuck at 8, 9, 10 win seasons and never really get any farther? And that would be great from where the Bears have been the last decade. That's progress. But can we aim higher? Can we go for a higher ceiling? Like Ben Johnson or Aaron Glenn or Joe Brady or Todd Monken, they might be a bad head coach. And they might, win 7 games, 6 games, and 7 games and be fired after 3 seasons. And we're doing the whole thing again. That's the risk that you run. But they could also be that coordinator who's just been waiting for the right opportunity, and they finally figured it out, and they've been a great head coach and waiting this whole time, but no one's given them a chance, and you give them the chance, and they do everything you ever wanted a head coach to do, and they take you all the way. And I think the difference in the NFL right now between the truly great coaches and everybody else is drastic. The difference between having the Dan Campbell's coaching staff and having John Harbaugh's coaching staff and Andy Reid's coaching staff compared to, say, the Dallas Cowboys coaching staff or the Miami Dolphins coaching staff or, the Atlanta Falcons coaching staff. Like the difference between a decent coaching staff and a great coaching staff is humongous right now. It's always the consistently great coaches that are finding themselves back on these deep playoff runs. And I just think going with the veteran head coach who's good but not great is dooming you to a limited amount of success. It's ensuring less failure, but it's also limiting success. And I would rather aim high and try and have the best possible chances with the Chicago Bears by going for the best possible coach and one that probably doesn't have as much experience doing it, but let's take the risk. You got to go all in on being the best you can instead of being scared, which is what the Bears tend to do. So they scared and try and do the safest choice, which would be probably Mike McCarthy. And then, oh God, are we going to do years of Mike McCarthy? I'm really hoping not. But no matter what the Bears decide, you can be sure we'll break it down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So be sure to check out Locked On Podcasts for any of your other favorite teams. We cover all the NBA teams, all the MLB teams, and all the NHL teams, plus college teams across the country. I'm sure we've got some of your other favorite sports teams covered here on the Locked On Podcast Network. So go check out their Locked On podcast. Then come on back tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Bears and another opportunity for you to bear down.